Jolly good. Good afternoon, everybody. What I'd like to do is just start with this view of the first Earthrise photograph that was taken from space by Apollo 8 in 1968. And I think it's worth reflecting as we look at this photograph, as astronaut Bill Anders pointed out, is the finite nature of the planet Earth as it looks from space. And that's finite in terms of resources that the planet provides for us. It's finite in terms of our climate, our water, and of course the impacts that our lifestyles can now have on every other living organism on Earth. And it's finite in the sense that if we get things wrong or we do irreversible damage, as that saying goes, there is no planet B. A bit of a somber start, but I just wanted to sort of try and get us to reflect a little bit out of our zone of Randwick, which we know isn't the centre of the universe, and just think of us as a planet in space. As Sam said, my name's Peter Maganov. I've got the good fortune to be the Sustainability Manager at Randwick Council, with responsibility for Council's environmental and sustainability programs and initiatives for the past 16 years. I'm down at the community centre at the moment, and we've got a bit of a unstable internet, so I've just left myself off camera view. I hope that's okay with you as an audience. Today's chat, and I'd like to keep it as a chat if that's okay with you, is really a little bit of background, and it is summed up by Randwick's climate reality. But what I was hoping to provide with you is more of a focus on some of the good reasons for optimism. I'd like to see if I could take the focus off the continuous stream of bad news, I guess, that we're exposed to on climate change, and let you know some of the remarkable and the very positive actions and solutions that are underway to climate change by a range of players. And if there's one thing I'd like to perhaps leave with you is that hopefully some of these points will be useful to you as takeaways. And I mean takeaways so that you want to find out a little bit more, that you're confident enough or prepared to discuss some of these points with your neighbours or your friends or your work colleagues, or perhaps to use them to motivate yourself to speak up and to take action wherever and whenever you can. So as you can see there, I'm just concentrating on the good news, and I'll take out the climate impacts from climate change to save a little bit of a time and keep the focus on what I call a positive. A little bit of background is in June 2018, I was lucky enough to attend the climate reality training that's provided free of charge by the former Vice President, Al Gore. It was held in Brisbane, obviously at a time when travel between states and countries was straightforward and permissible. And I hope we haven't forgotten that that's still possible at some stage in the future. One of Al Gore's key projects since following up his 2 climate change documentaries that he made, starting with An Inconvenient Truth in 2006, was this climate reality training presented around the globe. His aim has been to create an international network of individuals that are willing to help in the communication of climate change, the solutions that are available and the actions that are necessary to reduce future climate change impacts. And the Brisbane training was quite fascinating because it had representatives from 36 countries. Many of them were Pacific nations that were telling their story of how they're likely to be affected by climate change. But it also had Indigenous representatives from Australia, the Pacific and New Zealand, all of us looking at ways of sharing and broadening discussions on the important messages around climate change. Now, his climate change training has now reached 25,000 people over 46 different training sessions, including 2,000 individuals now trained in Australia. And because of where we're at the moment, his training is online around the world. And I'd recommend it if some of you are interested to take up that opportunity of carrying out the training in the comfort of your own home situation. So let's get going with the most recent positive news, if you like, and that is the most recent agreement on climate change. Late in 2015, political leaders from across the world signed on to the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this is aimed at setting a course towards keeping global average temperature increases to below 2 degrees Celsius. And in fact, to try and pursue efforts that would keep the temperature increases to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. A huge job. But what I'd like you to do is just reflect on something on the side of this. Just consider what it takes to convince 196 government and political leaders to sign on to an agreement like this. Leaders representing different cultures, different religious groups and faiths, different economic standpoints, different languages, and even different value systems. The significance of that many organisations from around the world signing is quite spectacular and motivating on its own, and it can hardly be overstated. But what I ask is, what do you think could possibly have influenced and enabled all these leaders with all these differences to trust the importance that such a declaration was important, and not only signing on to the agreement itself, but potentially agreeing to the future expectations and obligations that this declaration requires? Now, obviously, the significant part of this process was the thousands of scientists and the science that were behind the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the previous agreements to Paris, as well as the overarching reports that have been presented every 5 years by the International Panel on Climate Change. You may have heard it referred to as IPCC. The extent of the collaboration and the cooperation between science and scientists across these countries over decades, and it represents a comprehensive spectrum of scientific fields and expertise. And this is really something that's quite important to keep in mind, the significance of these agreements that have been signed off on, but the basis of the agreements and where that knowledge has come from to influence our leaders. And despite the rhetoric from one particular president, the US isn't legally allowed to withdraw until the day after the 2020 presidential election. And I know, as we all know, anything can happen. But as a good president likes to say himself, let's wait and see what happens. Now, as well as all these nations and leaders coming together with the Paris Agreement, by the beginning of this year, more than 250 global corporations and companies have responded to the challenge and made a commitment to go 100% renewable in their energy requirements. That's a huge task for these companies that have got offices and locations around the world, and that they have to be accountable for how they're going to either generate the 100% renewable energy from their own sites or to purchase 100% renewable under other accredited situations. So as well as the scientists and the corporations and the nations, by the beginning of this year, we've also had over 1,700 jurisdictions, including local governments and local authorities, that have separately declared a climate emergency for their particular location around the world. These 1,700 jurisdictions and authorities cover 820 million people around the world to date. And again, they're not waiting for policy direction to come. They've made the decision to make this declaration and move on it within their own responsibilities and functions. Of course, we're all used to the climate marches of our community members that are concerned around climate change. And they've been marching with their feet on this issue for more than 5 years. Tens of thousands of people, not just in cities around the world, but regions of our countries and our adjacent to our cities, are all expressing their own concern that governments need to do more and take more action on climate change. And of course, at the end of last year, they were joined by the school students also marching separately on the importance of climate change for the future that they have for their own jobs and their own children. This is an amazing groundswell of support and action being taken on climate change. The next slide covers our householders and residents in Australia who are voting with their rooftops as far as responding to climate change. And as you can see there, the percentage of homes now with rooftop solar is significant across the country. And Australia's now got one of the highest rates of solar uptake for rooftops of any country in the world. So between 20 and 25%, according to the calculations that are done from the installations recorded, have now got solar on their rooftops. Of course, we do have a few outliers, if you like, resistant to change, resistant to the message that our scientists and our national leaders are saying on climate change, and no doubt history is likely to judge them accordingly. I think what's fascinating is that our president in the United States has just come out recently or reportedly saying the same as he said about coronavirus, that climate change will one day just disappear and go away. Without being too disrespectful, let's hope that he does the same much sooner than climate change or coronavirus. I think something else that's really important is in this time of COVID, there has been a huge political dependence on scientific expertise, advice, and specialist information from experts and professionals in each of our countries and around the world. And of course, the question that we're entitled to ask and should be raising at the appropriate time is, will science on climate change be treated any differently once we get through the current crisis? Can the science that's been formulating over decades and providing direction be resisted and ignored by politicians in a COVID environment? Or will they finally rely on the science and the scientists to move forward in strong policy and strong implementation investments? The science around climate is very well known. We know what the budget of our atmosphere is for processing carbon dioxide. We know about our carbon in our water cycle. We know about the atmospheric impacts and changes caused by sunlight and heating. And we now know through the IPCC reports of the likely impacts of the buildup of human-induced gases in our thin atmosphere. We also know, and we know how to measure, where our greenhouse gases come from. We've identified the sources of them, and unfortunately, most of them are coming from human activities. But in saying this, it really does narrow down what we don't know. And if you like, one of those basic tenets of the information and science that we have is that the largest source of global warming pollution occurs from the burning of fossil fuels across those various activities that you just saw in the previous slide. And in fact, the carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas equivalent is being released into the atmosphere faster than at any time in the last 66 million years. 66 million years. But this is where I'd normally go into the doom and gloom stories about why we should be doing things on climate change. Let me just take you to the solutions, the positive aspects that you may not be as aware of that are underway or have been identified to respond to climate change. The technologies that we rely on or that have come into our reality are only a decade old. And when wind generation was identified around 2000 as an alternative to our energy, the estimation was that we would have 30 gigawatts of wind power by 2010. The reality was that goal was exceeded by more than 20 times by 2018. And what you can see is that Australia's wind capacity alone has more than trebled in just under a decade. Overseas, and in Australia, wind and solar energy are now cheaper than the electricity we can get from new coal or natural gas plants, which does beg the question about some of the recent announcements that have been made for where Australian governments should be investing in these solutions or alternatives. Overseas, again, the investment has shown that countries can actually generate much of their electricity from renewables. And in Germany, just in the first 6 months of 2020, wind energy was providing almost 50% of Germany's total power requirements. Only 20% of it was from coal-fired power stations. In Denmark, again, almost 50% of Denmark's electricity in 2019 was coming from wind power alone. And the estimates show, even with the intermittent nature of wind, that wind power can supply worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. In a similar startup to the solar energy market, when solar panels were very expensive, the solar energy market was expected to grow by 1 gigawatt per year by 2010. That projection was exceeded by 17 times by 2010, and less than a decade later, it was exceeded by 109, a factor of 109 times. In Australia, 6 new rooftop solar panels are being installed every minute on average. But just have a look at that map to the left. Here's the solar potential of Australia. And really, it just begs the question as to why we can't be renewable energy positive in terms of our energy generation, and why there's any talk of any reliance on anything but renewable energy, even in our built up areas here, from the solar potential represented in that map. So nearly 2 million residential properties in Australia have solar systems, which is more than 1 in 5 houses. And I think the recent calculations do show that that's significantly higher than that again. The clean energy investment in Australia reached a new record in 2018 at $9.9 billion. $9.9 billion of investment in renewables and away from fossil fuel power generation. Globally, you can see in 2009, the investment in new generation from renewables was on a par with investment in fossil fuel generation. In less than 5 years after that, the investment in renewables was more than double that of fossil fuels. And again, just before where we are now, it's almost 3 times higher investment in renewables over fossil fuel energy sources. The forecasts for future generation are even more surprising and if you like, intriguing. What you've got here in 2020 and the increase and the decrease in fossil fuel reliance by 2025 and again by 2030, almost 5 or 6 times more expectation on renewable investment. And that shows the nuclear component for those of some people that might think nuclear provides a viable alternative as well. Let's just recall or remember, there's enough solar energy reaching the Earth every hour to meet the planet's energy needs at the moment for a full year. So just like the solar potential map for Australia, it does raise questions as to why we are not shifting to a more renewable future. And other countries are seeing it. China is investing more than 53% in new capacity coming from solar and wind. In India, the higher population again, or the two highest populations globally, 65% of new electricity capacity in India is coming from solar and wind. In Europe, 88% of new electricity capacity in 2018 was coming from solar and wind. And although this figure's a little bit behind, unfortunately, this represents what happens when you don't have policy or government commitments to trying to make that shift between renewable and coal-fired electricity generation. Australia remains a strong laggard in that direction. And I know the Kentucky Coal Mining Museum is not likely to be one of the first places that you get to travel to when COVID's over with, but even Kentucky Coal Mining Museum can see the future is in solar. They're estimated to save between $8,000 and $10,000 in their energy costs each year from the solar that they installed on their roof. The largest solar plant in China at the moment in the Tengah Desert is covering around 1,200 kilometers of the land there, and is actually locally known as the Great Wall of Solar. Closely matched, if you like, by the new Golmud solar park that was opened, and that was providing electricity for less than the cost of power coming from coal burning in China. This is a solar thermal power plant in China as well, and this plant operates like a coal-fired power station would, except that in this case we've got 12,000 mirrors focusing their energy on that tower and enabling the plant to operate with steam turbines, just like if you like, a traditional power plant would. But at night time, the molten salt there keeps the turbines running from the heat that's generated during the day. Remarkable technology. The Vatican's seen, if you like, the writing on the wall, and the Pope's got his own encyclical out on the environment, which is warning of the perils and the dangers faced by our most vulnerable communities. But in 2010, the Vatican went ahead with a $660 million investment in solar panels on the Vatican, which was the largest at the time in Europe, and providing enough power for 40,000 homes. This shows the investment when the government's behind solar power. This is the Chilean solar market and the rapid opportunities that solar can provide to a country when the government supports it. It does finish. This is the amount of installed solar capacity that Chile is going to have, and a similar investment for India from 2013 to 2022. The difference when the government shows what they want to have occur in their own country. And just on the topic of India, some interesting data that you might be interested. This shows their electricity capacity that they're allowing for from coal, gas, and some nuclear up to the current time frame. And you can see the difference there in what they're expecting their energy to come from coal-fired, mainly coal-fired power. And this shows the renewable investment and the capacity additions they're going to have from renewable sources. And as one of the policy analysts says, in India, you'd have to be quite courageous to invest in coal in India at this point of time, which again raises some questions behind the Adani plan. And again, it's bound to come out in the future, but it really does raise serious doubts about the level of investment. The next couple of diagrams just show some of the technologies that are supporting a low carbon future, or if you like, the solutions. And as you can see, just like solar and wind power in 2010, a very low proportion of lighting technology was LED. But by 2025, the market's going to shift to or is expected to shift to more than 95% of total lighting coming from LED sources. A massive change in a short period of time, which again will contribute significantly to reduce carbon from lights. Similar, if you like, trend downwards in the price of battery storage as the price decrease occurred for solar technology. And of course, decisions like this one where Tesla built the world's largest battery storage facility in South Australia for the South Australian government, almost more of a challenge presented by one of the entrepreneurs in this field to the South Australian government and successfully completed by Tesla. Looking at transport, with transport having the fastest increase in contribution to greenhouse gases, this shows the global take-up of battery and hybrid vehicles, just around 5 million vehicles at the moment. Unfortunately, a much lower rate in Australia. Again, what a difference policy and government support is likely to make, as demonstrated in New Zealand, when just 1/5 the population of Australia can actually have more than 25% increased electric vehicles than you find here. And this one just shows the expectation as to the price parity between electric vehicles and internal combustion engines. The calculations or the estimates are that by 2023, the cost of an electric vehicle will be about the same, if not better, if you like, than the internal combustion engine vehicles. And with just a little bit of government incentive, that increase could be brought forward by at least a year. And countries around the world are seeing this. You know, many countries have phase-out dates for taking internal combustion engines out of their vehicles and relying on electric vehicles. And the car manufacturers are seeing the writing on the wall here too. All of these companies have agreed to produce equivalent electric models of their current models and phase out internal combustion engines or offer the alternative electric model version. Now, it won't stop you sitting in a traffic jam, but it will contribute significantly when this starts happening to reduce greenhouse emissions. In Australia, we've got or had 21,000 renewable energy jobs around the country. But globally, that number is more like 10 million people working directly or indirectly in the renewable energy sector. And in fact, in the United States, even as COVID occurs, the fastest growing job categories are still expected to be solar installers or wind turbine technicians by 2026. And there are more jobs in the US in solar as there are in coal mining. Again, this just goes against the rhetoric. This shows the number of coal-fired power station shutdowns in President Obama's first 4 years. And in Trump's first 2 years, this shows what was naturally occurring, if you like, with corporate decisions shutting down old, dirty coal-fired power stations. And by 2021, the US is expected not only to retire an additional 16 gigawatts of coal-fired generating capacity, but in that same time frame, they'll add 180 gigawatts of solar and wind generation. 180 gigawatts. China and India, for their populations, are still both on track to overachieve their Paris commitments. Australia is intending to rely on some very shonky economic and dodgy figures to try and meet its existing commitments. And of course, Australians and the community at large have high concerns about climate change and believe that the government and everybody should be contributing to try and reduce climate catastrophes. Now, just to bring that back home, I just want to outline for those of you that are residents that may not be as aware of what's happening locally. And I just want to outline very quickly the actions that Randwick Council is taking to try and respond to climate change. In March 2018, Council resolved to achieve 100% renewables and zero emissions for its operations by 2030. And in the following year, 2019, Council prepared a renewable energy roadmap, which actually mapped out how we can achieve those targets, and we've been implementing it over time. And those targets are now in our draft environment strategy, which was placed out for public exhibition for your comment. It's a very short strategy. It's still available to have your comments, and we'd be really happy to see you provide some thoughts and comments or ideas on the draft environment strategy that's out on public exhibition. But those targets are identified in that strategy, and we've also included a 60% emissions reduction target for the whole of Randwick City. For the past 2 years, and I understand that we've just found out that our third year application has been accepted, but we've achieved zero carbon accreditation under the Commonwealth Government's National Carbon Offset Standard, now known as Climate Active. But it means that we've been buying offsets to pay for or to bring down council's existing carbon emissions. And we're only the second New South Wales council to have received this accreditation after the City of Sydney. In May last year, we became the 15th local council in Australia to declare a climate emergency. There are now over 100, and this has also been incorporated into our environment strategy. As of July last year, 20% of council's electricity is being generated from the Moree solar farm, and our strategy says that we have to buy 100% renewable energy for council's electricity by 2025. We currently have a free energy advisory service for residents and businesses through the Australian Energy Foundation, so that residents and businesses can get free and reliable quotes on installing rooftop solar and other energy efficiency measures. And council has just recently approved financial rebates for residents and businesses for certain energy saving and renewable actions. So keep an eye out for that one or ask some questions. The rebates are expected to be available later in the year, and they'll provide incentives for residents and businesses to take a comprehensive range of measures to bring down their energy bills. And we have a collaboration with our neighbouring Waverley and Wallara councils that's been going for more than 10 years now. And through that program, we're also implementing a low carbon future plan for our eastern suburbs. And one of our commitments or programs, the Solar My Schools initiative, has now more than 94% of eastern suburban schools being supported to place rooftop solar on their school rooftops. And these schools, of which we've got 60 out of 64 involved, now have the second, third, fourth and fifth largest rooftop solar installation in the east, other than the university. As well as that, after a 2-year program, we provided the first public electric vehicle charging stations that are rolled out by a local government in the Sydney metropolitan region. And those two first EV charging stations have been topped up in Randwick with another 6. So at the moment, we've got 8 public electric vehicle charging stations available to encourage the take-up of electric vehicles. As Al Gore was sort of signalling to us, the message to people is use your voice, use your vote, and use your choices you can make across everything that you do, the purchases, the contacts, the discussions you have, and use these because, or like, your world depends on it. Because as we saw, it does. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. What are we up to?
Thanks very much, Peter. If anyone has any questions they want to pop in the chat, feel free to do so. We can read them out. If not, I'm just going to pop the link into the chat as well for where you can see all the other events that are going on across this weekend.
Thank you. There's the chat. I'll just unshare that, Sam.
Yeah, if you'd like to. We've had a question come here from Michael Woods about, would like to know what's happening across the world with waste. If we can get a quick update on what we know about the waste situation in the world.
Yeah, it's a good one. I probably can't talk about what's happening around the world, except there does seem to be a fairly strong trend to try and get food organics out of the waste stream. And I guess representing that is in Australia alone, almost 50% of what's in our red lid bins is food waste and food organics. So really, if you can get food waste out of your bin and recovered, which is what is occurring across local councils across Australia, and Randwick's offering a new service starting from March next year. If you can get that food waste out, you can also reduce your waste going to landfill and the methane that comes out of those landfills, which has a much higher greenhouse potential than carbon dioxide itself. The other important message with food waste, Michael, is it's about avoiding the waste in the first place. And council and a lot of councils around Australia and organisations are trying and minimise the waste that we have that even goes into our red lid bins. And you know, as you've probably heard, there's enough food being grown around the world to meet our population needs, but in developing countries, more than 1/5 of the food that's produced doesn't even make it to our household. It's thrown out, it's wasted, it goes off. So we really, you know, need to concentrate on that as much as our recycling efforts, because it's waste that contributes to greenhouse through methane reductions as well.
It's actually Mitch Woods, Pete, from formerly from Randwick.
Sorry, Mitch. My apologies. Greetings.
It's good to hear your voice again. Do you think is there enough emphasis on council's waste strategy being put on council's waste strategies?
I don't know if I should take up the time, Mitch, but is there? I mean, look, waste. And again, sorry, Sam, if I can indulge people just for 1 minute. I think the food waste is almost representative of our lifestyle. In Australia, the affluence we have means that we can buy a lot of things, and a lot of those things end up in the waste stream, whether it be food or solid items. And there's a calculation called your ecological footprint, if people want to look it up. And the ecological footprint represents all the resources that cities or individuals consume each year. And in Australia, we're consuming something like the equivalent of 5 to 6 planets of resources each year. So I think, you know, this is like a compounding problem to climate change. Is if we're absorbing that much material or food or whatever it is that's not being able to be replenished, we're obviously damaging the finite resources of our planet. So it's not just about the waste stream, it's probably about our affluence. And again, that gets back to the choices that we make. Thanks, Mitch.
Peter, if you have a moment, we have some other good questions that have come in. We also had a question about the Fight for Planet A, which also highlighted the issue of plastic packaging and recycling. They mentioned that South Australia has gone plastic free. When will Randwick Council and the rest of Sydney go plastic free? And what can be done about the confusion around what plastics can and can't be recycled?
Yeah, I wish there were easy answers. Randwick has technically gone plastic free for the council operations and in the events that we support. But what we aren't capable of doing is putting a blanket statement over local businesses and sort of encroach on their business operations by saying they can't have single-use plastics. So in our environment strategy, one of the approaches that we're taking in the environment strategy is to work with businesses to try and find ways to either reduce their single-use plastic use or to avoid it altogether. So, you know, council is attempting to try and do it, but I think what you're implying is correct. What we need is a global approach to banning these substances, and New South Wales stands out for its lack of consistent approach to reducing single-use plastics. And again, it's more about the lobbying and putting pressure on your local members that New South Wales joins with all the other states and territories almost in making legislated changes to reduce this type of waste in particular.
Great. I might just, one more question. We also have a good comment in here from Tanya, who's loving to hear about FOGO. Anyone who didn't tune into today's FOGO, FOGO stands for Food Organics, Garden Organics. There's a webinar today about that, so make sure you tune in when that recording is available. There's also a question here which we might try and wrap up with is, given the public is obviously so keen about solar, why does the political will to build it for everything seem to lag so far behind? And I'll add on to that. Is there anything you think we can do to maybe push policy or politics to make solar happen more so?
I think the argument about having a base load met by fossil fuel power stations needs to be challenged. And as the investments and the energy providers show, is that they can provide much more energy from renewables to meet our requirements. And the idea of battery storage, although it's still expensive, you know, offsets that argument as to why you can't rely on renewables. But I mean, I think this is where actually understanding and being confident in defending or arguing against the defence that politicians will put up and trying to present facts back at them so that they're put back on their, you know, in their positions is a really important way of trying to keep the pressure up on them. And talk to your local members, because our local members or your local members may not have the time to be aware of this. And if you talk to them about these kind of solutions as being practical, affordable, and technologically feasible, then that gives them the confidence to go back and challenge the resistant members that exist in you know, all sides of politics as well. Is there one other thing there, Sam?
There is, if you've got time for it. We've had a question come in here from Duncan. He wanted to know your views on, do you think there is much that homeowners, councils and businesses in Randwick can do together to collectively reduce carbon emissions?
Good. And it's a great question because the answer is yes. The separate approach which is available now would probably be considering whether you can buy green power as a way of offsetting the energy that you normally might purchase from a fossil fuel power source, but even to check with the energy providers that you've got that they offer alternative green power accredited energy. You know, you can either buy it from your own one or you can look around and change over to somebody that has that. But the other meaningful opportunity, as council's doing and the universities demonstrated, is looking for ways where the organisation you're with and the council's looking at some opportunities that might exist, is to buy your power from a renewable power source like we're doing with the Moree solar farm. Because that means, you know, it's not a straightforward solution in one sense, but it means that all the electricity is coming from a renewable power source. And that's a really important way, you know, if you like, across a wide geographical area or a group of organisations to avoid the carbon that's coming from fossil fuel powered power stations.
Great, that's quite a good segue actually into, if you haven't checked out some of the events that are coming up across the next 2 days. We have energy saving in home, which does cover green power as well and rooftop solar, etc. We have electric vehicles. We know a lot of residents in Randwick are living in apartments. We have a webinar especially on how to install solar on strata. So please check out all of them. Another comment to end on is Azuman has sent in that he's really enjoyed the session, and some more regular discussions on climate issues would be great. Yeah, I think we definitely agree there. So we might end it there. And thank you very much, Peter, for all this today.
No worries. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Peter.